The aluminum baseball bat connected with my kneecap with a sound that still echoes in nightmares, a wet crack followed by my own scream cutting through the humid August air. I was 14, sprawled on the concrete driveway of our split-level house on Maple Street, watching my leg bend in ways that defied every anatomical diagram I'd ever seen in biology class. The pain arrived in waves, each one more crushing than the last, like someone was taking a blowtorch to the inside of my bones. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Jessi, get up! My mother's voice carried from the kitchen window, sharp with irritation rather than concern. She was washing dishes, her back turned to the chaos unfolding in our driveway. Stop being so dramatic. My brother Marcus stood over me, the Louisville Slugger still gripped in his 17-year-old hands, his face a mask of practiced indifference. He'd been aiming for the old tire swing hanging from our oak tree, or so he would claim later. The bat had slipped, he'd say. An accident. Just kids being kids in the suburban wasteland of Millbrook, Ohio. But I saw the calculation in his dark eyes, the same look he got when he was dissecting frogs in AP biology. Marcus never did anything by accident. Everything was measured, planned, executed with the precision of someone who understood consequences and simply didn't care about them. He was Golden Boy Marcus, headed to Ohio State on a full academic scholarship, the son who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. "I can't move," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of Mrs. Henderson's lawn sprinkler next door. The elderly woman was tending to her prize-winning roses, her weathered hands gentle with the delicate petals. She looked up at my cry, her face creasing with concern, but she was too far away to see the extent of the damage. "Marcus, help your bee." "Sister up!" Dad called from the garage where he was tinkering with his 1987 Camaro, the car that had become his refuge from family life. His voice held that familiar edge of exhaustion, the tone of a man who'd given up on solving problems and now just wanted them to disappear. Mrs. Chen from across the street was walking her ancient poodle, Buttons, and she paused at the edge of our property. Her kind eyes met mine, and I saw a recognition flash across her features, not just of pain, but of something deeper, more troubling. She'd been a nurse for 30 years before retiring, and she understood the difference between playground scrapes and real injury. The kneecap, my patella, I would learn later, had split into 3 distinct pieces, like a broken dinner plate that someone had tried to reassemble with hope instead of glue. The fragments were already beginning to shift, grinding against each other with every slight movement, every shallow breath. I could feel them moving under my skin like puzzle pieces that would never fit together quite right again. Marcus finally moved, but not to help me. He walked over to the tire swing and gave it a casual push, as if demonstrating what he'd been trying to hit all along. The old Michelin tire swayed back and forth, its rope creaking against the oak branch that Dad had installed when I was 7 and still believed my big brother hung the moon. "She's fine," Marcus announced to no one in particular. "Just being a baby about it." The sun was beginning to set behind the Hendersons' house, casting long shadows across our driveway. I remember focusing on those shadows, using them as an anchor against the pain that was trying to drag me under. The concrete beneath me was still warm from the day's heat, and I could smell the familiar mixture of motor oil from Dad's garage, charcoal from someone's backyard barbecue, and the sweet scent of honeysuckle that grew wild along our back fence. Our house on Maple Street had been built in 1962, part of the post-war suburban boom that transformed farmland into neat rows of middle-class dreams. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a 2-car garage, and a 1/4-acre lot where children were supposed to play safely under their parents' watchful eyes. The American dream, painted in beige vinyl siding and trimmed with hunter green shutters. But dreams, I was learning, could become nightmares with frightening speed. Mrs. Chen took a step closer, her poodle straining against its rhinestone leash. Jessi, honey, are you hurt? Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen enough injuries to recognize the real thing. She's fine, Mom called from the window, her voice sharp with embarrassment. Kids these days, everything's a crisis. I tried to sit up, tried to prove them right, tried to be the tough kid they expected me to be. But the moment I shifted my weight, the broken pieces of my kneecap shifted too, sending lightning bolts of agony up my thigh and down my shin. I collapsed back onto the concrete, tears streaming down my face. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth where I'd bitten, my tongue to keep from screaming. My hands were scraped raw from trying to break my fall, little pebbles of gravel embedded in my palms like glitter that had been pressed too deep to brush away. Marcus leaned the bat against the garage wall, right next to Dad's collection of garden tools. The same wall where my school photos hung in cheap plastic frames, elementary school snapshots where I smiled with missing teeth and uncombed hair back when I still believed that being good was enough to keep you safe. I'm going inside, Marcus announced, brushing imaginary dirt off his hands. Mom's making tacos. He walked past me without a glance, his footsteps echoing on the concrete steps that led to our front door. The screen door slammed behind him with a sound like a gunshot, and I was alone on the driveway except for Mrs. Chen and her concerned gaze. The pain was evolving now, no longer the sharp crack of initial impact, but a deep, throbbing ache that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. I could feel swelling beginning around the injury site, my skin growing tight and hot. My leg was starting to look wrong, not just bent, but alien, like it belonged to someone else entirely. Mrs. Chen, I called out, my voice cracking with pain and desperation. Could you call someone? She was already reaching for the phone in her pocket, her nurse's instincts overriding any social boundaries about interfering in neighbors' affairs. But before she could dial, my mother appeared at the front door, her dish towel still in her hands. Jessi Marie Thompson, get up this instant. Mom's voice carried that particular blend of frustration and martyrdom that she'd perfected over 14 years of motherhood. You're going to stain the concrete. The absurdity of her concern, for the concrete rather than her daughter, might have been funny under different circumstances. Our driveway was already stained with years of oil leaks from Dad's various automotive projects, decorated with chalk art from neighborhood kids, and cracked from Ohio's brutal freeze-thaw cycles. Mrs. Chen's face hardened. Helen, this child needs medical attention? Now. She needs to stop being so dramatic, Mom replied. But there was uncertainty creeping into her voice. Even from 20 feet away, she could see that this wasn't normal playground theatrics. The golden hour light was fading into twilight, and streetlights were beginning to flicker on throughout our neighborhood. Somewhere down the block, someone was playing music, an old Fleetwood Mac song that drifted through the evening air like a soundtrack to suburban dysfunction. The normalcy of it all felt surreal against the backdrop of my shattered kneecap and my family's determined indifference. I closed my eyes and tried to remember a time when home felt safe, when my parents' love seemed unconditional, when Marcus was just my annoying older brother instead of someone who could hurt me without consequence. But those memories felt like someone else's life, stories from a childhood that had ended the moment that baseball bat changed trajectory. The last thing I saw before pain dragged me into unconsciousness was Mrs. Chen's determined face as she dialed 911, her voice steady and sure as she gave our address to the emergency dispatcher. In that moment, she became more than just our neighbor. She became the first adult in my life to choose my well-being over social convention. When I regained consciousness, I was still on the driveway, but the world had shifted around me like a kaleidoscope, finding a new pattern. Paramedics knelt beside me, their hands gentle but efficient as they assessed the damage Marcus had done. The older one, whose name tag read Rodriguez, had kind eyes that reminded me of my third-grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, the last adult who had made me feel truly safe. "Easy there, sweetheart," Rodriguez said as I tried to sit up. We're going to take good care of you. My parents stood nearby, but not too close. Close enough to appear concerned, far enough to maintain plausible distance from responsibility. It was a dance they'd perfected over years of Marcus's increasingly disturbing behavior. Always present enough to seem involved, never present enough to actually intervene. The younger paramedic, Johnson, was preparing a splint while talking into his radio. 14-year-old female with what appears to be a displaced patellar fracture. Patient is conscious and responsive but shows signs of shock. We're going to need orthopedic surgery standing by. The words washed over me like a foreign language. Displaced, patellar, surgery. These weren't words that belonged in my carefully ordered teenage world of algebra homework and Friday night football games. These were adult words, crisis words, words that changed everything. Mrs. Chen had positioned herself between my parents and the paramedics, her small frame radiating protective fury. She'd changed from her gardening clothes into a crisp white, blouse and navy slacks, the uniform of someone preparing for battle. In her hands, she clutched a manila folder that I would later learn contained printed articles about child abuse, domestic violence resources, and a detailed timeline of every concerning incident she'd witnessed from across the street. This wasn't an accident, she told Rodriguez in a voice low enough that my parents couldn't hear. There's a pattern here. The paramedic's expression didn't change, but I caught the slight nod he gave her. The way his partner's radio calls became more detailed, more urgent. These were people trained to read between the lines of family dynamics, to recognize the signs that loving parents missed and neglectful ones ignored. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I caught a glimpse of Marcus watching from his bedroom window. His face was illuminated by the blue light of his computer screen, and he looked neither guilty nor concerned. He looked curious, like he was observing the results of an interesting experiment. The same expression he wore when watching his auntie farm or timing how long it took different insects to die under his magnifying glass. The ride to Millbrook General Hospital passed in a haze of pain medication and the rhythmic wail of sirens. Through the small window, I watched our neighborhood shrink away. The neat lawns and matching mailboxes, the basketball hoops and swing sets, all the props of normal childhood that had never quite fit my experience. Rodriguez held my hand during the worst bumps, his calloused palm warm and steady against my clammy skin. "Tell me about yourself, Jessi," he said, his voice cutting through the mechanical sounds of the ambulance. "What do you like to do?" It should have been a simple question, but it left me speechless. What did I like to do? I spent most of my time trying to be invisible, trying to avoid Marcus's attention, trying to predict which version of my parents I'd encounter on any given day. My hobbies had become survival strategies, reading in hidden corners where Marcus couldn't find me, volunteering for after-school activities that kept me away from home, befriending neighbors like Mrs. Chen who offered glimpses of how families were supposed to function. I like to write, I finally said. And it was true. In spiral notebooks hidden under my mattress, I wrote stories about girls who were brave, families who protected each other, homes where love wasn't conditional on performance or convenience. "What kind of stories do you write?" Rodriguez asked. And I could tell he was genuinely interested, not just trying to keep me conscious. "Happy ones," I whispered, and we both understood the weight of what I wasn't saying. The emergency room at Millbrook General was a fluorescent-lit maze of organized chaos. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency between curtained bays, their soft-soled shoes squeaking against waxed linoleum floors. The smell of antiseptic couldn't quite mask the underlying odors of fear, pain, and human desperation that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Dr. Sarah Winters was the orthopedic surgeon on call, and she arrived within minutes of my admission, with the focused energy of someone who understood that bones were puzzles and she was exceptionally good at solving them. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with short auburn hair and hands that moved with surgical precision even during casual conversation. "Let's see what we're dealing with here," she said, her voice warm but professional as she examined the X-rays that had just come back from radiology. The images looked like abstract art to me, black and white swirls punctuated by bright white, fragments that used to be my kneecap. Dr. Winters pointed to different areas on the film, explaining the extent of the damage in terms I could understand. Complete patellar fracture, 3 major fragments, possible ligament damage, surgery required within 24 hours to prevent permanent disability. My parents had arrived by then, driving separately in Dad's Camaro while Mom followed in her Honda Civic. They stood at the foot of my hospital bed like awkward visitors rather than concerned parents, their discomfort palpable in the sterile air of the emergency room. "So when can she go home?" Mom asked, as if a shattered kneecap was something that could be fixed with a bandage and a good night's sleep. Dr. Winters looked up from my chart, her expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Thompson, your daughter is going to need immediate surgery and several days of hospitalization. This is a serious injury." "But it was just an accident," Dad interjected, his voice carrying that familiar note of defensive irritation. "Kids have accidents all the time." "Tell me exactly how this accident occurred," Dr. Winters said, her tone still professional but with an edge that suggested she'd had similar conversations before. The story my parents told was a masterpiece of selective editing. Marcus had been practicing his swing in the backyard. The bat slipped from his hands. I happened to be walking by at exactly the wrong moment. Pure chance. One of those things that just happen in active families with athletic children. But Dr. Winters was asking different questions. How far away was I when the bat slipped? What was the angle of impact? Why was I walking through Marcus's practice area? Had there been other accidents involving Marcus and his younger sister? Each question carved away another piece of the carefully constructed narrative my parents had built. Under Dr. Winters's gentle but persistent inquiry, the holes in their story became chasms. "I'd like to speak with Jessi privately," Dr. Winters finally said, and it wasn't really a request. My parents exchanged the kind of look that married couples develop over years, of shared secrets, part worry, part warning, part resignation. They retreated to the waiting room, leaving me alone with the first adult who seemed more interested in my well-being than in maintaining family harmony. "Jessi," Dr. Winters said, pulling up a chair beside my bed, "I need you to tell me what really happened." The morphine made everything feel soft around the edges, like reality had been wrapped in cotton. But the pain of keeping secrets, I realized, hurt worse than the broken bones. So I told her everything. About Marcus's experiments with insects and small animals. About the accidents that always seemed to happen when adults weren't watching. About the basement where he'd set up what he called his laboratory, complete with specimen jars and detailed notebooks documenting various forms of suffering. I told her about the time he'd locked me in the old refrigerator in our garage, timing. How long I could survive without air. About the carefully orchestrated games that always ended with me injured and him fascinated by my reactions. About parents who had perfected the art of looking the other way, who treated his cruelty as childhood mischief and my fear as feminine. Weakness. Dr. Winters listened without judgment, making notes in handwriting so small I couldn't read it upside down. Her face remained professionally composed, but I caught glimpses of something harder underneath. The steel core of someone who had chosen a profession dedicated to fixing what was broken. "Jessi," she said when I finished, "has anyone ever talked to you about mandatory reporting?" I shook my head, though something about her tone made my stomach clench with nervous anticipation. "When doctors, teachers, or other professionals see signs that a child might be in danger, we're required by law to report it to Child Protective Services. It's not about punishment. It's about making sure kids are safe." The room seemed to shrink. Around us, the implications of her words expanding to fill every corner of available space. CPS. The specter that haunted dysfunctional families like ours. The threat that parents use to ensure children's silence. "If you tell anyone, they'll Split up the family. You'll end up in foster care with strangers. You'll destroy everything. But as I lay there in that hospital bed, my kneecap in pieces and my body already bearing the phantom aches of old injuries, I realized that our family was already destroyed. The only question was whether I would survive long enough for someone to notice. Dr. Winters reached over and squeezed my uninjured hand. "You're not responsible for whatever happens next, Jessi. You're 14 years old. Your job is to be 14, not to protect adults from the consequences of their choices." Through the thin walls of the emergency room bay, I could hear my parents' voices in the waiting room, their conversation a familiar symphony of blame and deflection. Mom's higher register cutting through Dad's defensive mumbling, both of them working to construct a version of events that absolved them of responsibility. But their words couldn't reach me here, couldn't reshape reality to fit their comfortable narrative of accident and overreaction. Here, in the harsh fluorescent light of the emergency room, truth had weight and consequences. Here, broken bones were evidence and patterns had names. Dr. Winters stood up, her chair scraping against the polished floor. "I'm going to go make some phone calls now," she said. "And then we're going to fix your knee. Both of those things are going to happen tonight, and both of them are going to change your life." As she walked away, her white coat disappeared around the corner like an angel's wing. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine what change might feel like, what safety might cost, what healing might demand. Outside my window, Millbrook continued its suburban slumber, unaware that in room 127 of the emergency department, a 14-year-old girl was finally learning that some secrets were too dangerous to keep. The surgery took place at 6:30 the next morning, in operating room 3, with its banks of overhead lights that turned everything the color of bleached bone. Dr. Winters explained the procedure beforehand, her words precise and confident as she outlined how they would reconstruct my kneecap using surgical screws and wire, essentially rebuilding what Marcus had destroyed with calculated violence. "When you wake up, things will be different," she told me as the anesthesia mask descended over my face. I thought she was talking about my leg, but I would soon learn she meant everything. The social worker arrived while I was still in recovery, her presence announced by the click of sensible heels against hospital linoleum and the rustle of official paperwork. Barbara Martinez was in her early 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that had seen enough family dysfunction to recognize its patterns from across a crowded room. She introduced herself to my parents first. Her voice professionally warm but underlaid with the kind of authority that came from state certification and legal backing. I watched through the partially open door of my room as she explained the situation in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. A report had been filed with Child Protective Services. An investigation would be conducted. Interviews would be scheduled with all family members, starting immediately. My parents' faces went through a progression of emotions: surprise, anger, denial, and finally a kind of cold calculation that I'd seen before when they discussed family finances or disciplinary strategies. "This is ridiculous," Mom said, her voice pitched to carry just far enough to reach my bed without seeming intentionally performative. "Jessi is accident-prone, always has been. She's clumsy, like her father." But Ms. Martinez had Dr. Winters' medical report, complete with detailed photographs of the injury pattern and biomechanical analysis that made accidental impact virtually impossible. She had Mrs. Chen's sworn statement, documenting years of concerning behavior and suspicious injuries. She had my own testimony, recorded while the morphine made lying feel impossible and truth feel like the only path to safety. The first interview took place in a small conference room down the hall from the pediatric ward, its walls decorated, with cheerful posters about hand-washing and stranger danger, innocent childhood concerns that seemed quaint compared to the reality of family violence. Ms. Martinez sat across from me with a digital recorder between us, her questions delivered, with the gentle persistence of water wearing away stone. "Tell me about your relationship with Marcus," she said, and I understood that this was the moment when our family's carefully maintained facade would finally crumble. I started with the recent incidents: the baseball bat, the refrigerator game, the basement laboratory where he documented different methods of causing pain. But Ms. Martinez wanted more context, deeper history, the progression of events that had led to this moment of reckoning. So I told her about elementary school, when Marcus's experiments focused on insects and small animals, how he'd graduated to testing the limits of human endurance, using me as his primary subject since I was smaller, weaker, and conditioned to believe that resistance was futile. I described the intricate psychological games he played, the way he'd convinced me that his abuse was scientific research, that my pain served a higher purpose of understanding human limitations, how he'd frame his cruelty as education, teaching me about anatomy while breaking my bones, explaining physics while demonstrating the trajectory of falling objects. The basement laboratory was his masterpiece, a converted storage room where he kept detailed journals of his experiments, complete with photographs and measurements. Specimen jars lined makeshift shelves, containing insects, small reptiles, and other creatures that had served their research purpose. In the center of the room sat an old dentist's chair he'd found at a garage sale, equipped with restraints he'd fashioned from hardware store materials. "Where did he get the dentist's chair?" Ms. Martinez asked, her pen moving across her notepad in quick, efficient strokes. "Dad helped him move it downstairs," I said, and watched something shift in her expression. Mom thought it was creative, that Marcus was interested in science. The complicity of my parents was perhaps more damaging than Marcus's actual violence. They had created an environment where his behavior was not just tolerated, but celebrated as academic excellence. His detailed documentation was praised as scientific methodology. His lack of empathy was dismissed as intellectual focus. His victims, neighborhood, pets, insects, and eventually me, were considered acceptable casualties in the pursuit of knowledge. Ms. Martinez asked about school, about teachers who might have noticed injuries or behavioral changes. I told her about Mrs. Patterson, my third-grade teacher, who had kept me after class one day to ask about bruises on my arms. I'd been 8 years old, already trained to protect Marcus from consequences, so I'd lied about falling off my bike. Mrs. Patterson had looked at me with such sadness, as if she understood the weight of secrets I was carrying but couldn't figure out how to help me carry them. She'd started finding excuses to keep me after school: extra help with math, opportunities to clean the classroom, any reason to delay my return home. For a few months, those afternoon sessions had been my sanctuary. But then, Marcus had figured out what was happening. He'd started walking me home from school, his presence a constant reminder that escape was temporary and consequences were inevitable. Mrs. Patterson had tried once more to reach out, calling my parents to express concern about my emotional withdrawal. The conversation had resulted in a family meeting where I was reminded about the importance of loyalty, about how outside interference could destroy everything we'd built together. "What did that family meeting look like?" Ms. Martinez asked, and I realized she was documenting not just abuse but the systematic cover-up that had enabled it. The meetings always followed the same pattern. We'd sit around the dining room table, the same table where we ate holiday meals and celebrated Marcus's academic achievements. Dad would speak first, his voice heavy with disappointment about my failure to maintain family privacy. Mom would add emotional weight, tears streaming down her face as she described how my disloyalty was breaking her heart. Marcus would sit quietly, his expression neutral, but his eyes bright with satisfaction. These sessions were as much for his entertainment as for my correction. He enjoyed watching our parents do his enforcement work, enjoyed seeing how thoroughly they'd been manipulated into protecting his interests above mine. The consequences for talking to outsiders were swift and creative. Grounding that lasted for months. Removal of privileges like books, music, or phone calls to friends. But the most effective punishment was the withdrawal of what little parental affection had been available before. I would become invisible in my own house, spoken around rather than to, my needs ignored until I apologized sufficiently for my betrayal. How long did these punishments typically last? Ms. Martinez asked. Until the next time Marcus needed to. Experiment, I said, and she stopped writing to look directly at me. The pattern was as predictable as seasonal weather. Marcus would grow bored with his current projects and start looking for new subjects, new methods, new ways to test the boundaries of power and pain. My parents' anger at my supposed betrayal would fade into background white noise, making me available once again for whatever Marcus had planned. The basement sessions had begun when I was 10 and he was 13, old enough to understand anatomy, but young enough to be curious about how bodies worked when subjected to stress. He'd started with simple experiments. How long could I hold? My breath. How much weight could I carry? How many hours could I go without water? But curiosity, once awakened, demanded increasing stimulation. The experiments became more elaborate, more painful, more psychologically sophisticated. He'd learned to document everything, creating scientific justification for what he was doing. Charts tracking my recovery time from various injuries. Graphs measuring my pain response to different stimuli. Detailed notes about which psychological approaches were most effective at ensuring my cooperation. The dentist's chair had been the final evolution of his research setup. With me restrained, he could work more precisely, testing nerve responses and measuring physiological changes with equipment he'd ordered online using Mom's credit card. She'd been so proud when the packages arrived, so pleased that Marcus was taking his education seriously. "Did your parents ever see you in the chair?" Ms. Martinez asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Mom brought us snacks sometimes," I said, remembering the surreal normalcy of those moments. She thought Marcus was tutoring me in biology. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. My parents could look directly at their daughter restrained, in a dentist's chair while their son took notes about her pain responses, and they chose to see academic enrichment. They could observe my injuries, my fear, my increasingly desperate attempts to avoid the basement, and they chose to interpret it as sibling rivalry or adolescent dramatics. Ms. Martinez set down her pen and folded her hands on the table. "Jessi, I need you to understand something important. What happened to you was not normal sibling conflict. What Marcus did was criminal assault. What your parents did by enabling it was criminal neglect. None of this was your fault." The words should have felt liberating, but instead they felt terrifying. If Marcus was a criminal and my parents were neglectful, then everything I'd believed about family, loyalty, and love was wrong. If my normal wasn't actually normal, then I had to reconstruct my entire understanding of how the world was supposed to work. "What happens now?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "Now we make sure you're safe," she said, "and we hold the adults responsible for what they allowed to happen." The investigation moved forward with bureaucratic momentum, each interview and home inspection adding another layer to the case file that would eventually land on a family court judge's desk. Dr. Winters had documented the medical evidence with surgical precision, creating an anatomical argument that made accidental injury impossible to claim. Mrs. Chen had provided years of observations from across the street, the screaming that came from our basement, the way I'd learned to walk without, limping despite obvious injuries, the gradual transformation of a bright 8-year-old into a withdrawn teenager who jumped at unexpected sounds. Other neighbors came forward once the investigation became public knowledge. Mrs. Henderson had noticed that I never played in our backyard anymore, always finding excuses to stay in front of the house where people could see me. Mr. Peterson from 2 doors down had seen me climbing out of my bedroom window on school nights, sleeping in his tool shed when the basement experiments ran too late. The physical evidence was overwhelming. When investigators finally gained access to Marcus's laboratory, they found detailed documentation going back 4 years, hundreds of photographs, meticulously recorded data about pain tolerance, recovery time, and psychological breaking points. Equipment that belonged in research facilities, not suburban basements. But perhaps most damning was Marcus's complete lack of remorse when confronted with the evidence. He expressed pride in his scientific methodology, frustration that his research had been interrupted, and genuine confusion about why adults were so upset about what he considered educational activities. "I was helping her understand biology," he told Ms. Martinez during his interview, his voice carrying the earnest conviction of someone who truly believed his own justifications. "Pain is just data. She was contributing to knowledge." The interview? Recordings would later be played in court, and the casual way Marcus discussed torture would send chills through seasoned family court professionals. There was no recognition that I was his sister, rather than a laboratory specimen. No acknowledgement that his data collection had caused lasting physical and psychological damage. My parents' interviews revealed a different kind of pathology, the willful blindness that had allowed Marcus's behavior to escalate unchecked. They had created elaborate explanations for every concerning sign, built sophisticated denial systems that could rationalize any evidence that didn't fit their preferred narrative. When confronted with photographs of the basement laboratory, they claimed they'd never seen it despite doing laundry in the adjacent room. When shown Marcus's journals documenting years of systematic abuse, they insisted the entries were creative writing exercises. When played audio recordings of my screams from the basement, they suggested I had been practicing for school drama productions. The depth of their self-deception was almost as disturbing as Marcus's lack of empathy. They had chosen to protect their image of family normalcy over their daughter's safety, and they maintained that choice even when presented with irrefutable evidence of its consequences. Dr. Winters testified about the medical evidence, her professional demeanor masking what I could see was personal outrage at what had been done to me. She explained how the pattern of my injuries over the years told a story that no amount of parental denial could rewrite. Multiple fractures that had healed improperly because they'd never received proper medical attention. Nerve damage from prolonged restraint. Psychological trauma that would require years of therapy to address. The accumulated impact of systematic abuse that had been disguised as family life. "In 30 years of practice," Dr. Winters told the court, "I have never seen such extensive deliberate injury inflicted on a child by a family member. The level of planning and documentation suggests a predatory mindset that poses ongoing danger to any potential victims." The courtroom was packed with people whose lives had intersected with our family's dysfunction. Teachers who had noticed but hadn't known how to intervene. Neighbors who had heard but hadn't understood. Medical professionals who had treated injuries but hadn't recognized patterns. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, her presence a reminder that sometimes caring neighbors could see what biological families refused to acknowledge. She had brought photo albums documenting my transformation from happy child to fearful teenager, visual evidence of how abuse changed not just bodies, but souls. The defense attorney hired by my parents tried to minimize the evidence, suggesting that Marcus's behavior was the result of untreated mental illness rather than criminal intent. They painted a picture of a family in crisis, overwhelmed by a child's psychological problems and lacking resources to address them properly. But Ms. Martinez had done her homework. She'd interviewed Marcus's teachers, his classmates, his guidance counselors. What emerged was a portrait of someone who was perfectly capable of controlling his behavior when consequences existed. He'd never hurt a classmate, never violated school rules, never showed any sign of the uncontrollable impulses his lawyers claimed. His violence had been reserved exclusively for victims who couldn't fight back and environments where adults wouldn't intervene. That selectivity, Ms. Martinez argued, proved premeditation rather than pathology. The judge, the Honorable Rebecca Walsh, had been presiding over family court for 15 years and had developed the kind of grim expertise that came from seeing humanity at its worst. She listened to weeks of testimony with professional composure, but her questions revealed someone who understood the long-term implications of childhood trauma. "The court finds," Judge Walsh said, when she finally delivered her verdict, "that the defendants engaged in systematic child abuse over a period of years, and that their neglect and active enabling of this abuse created an environment of ongoing danger for the victim." Marcus was sentenced as a juvenile to residential treatment until his 18th birthday, followed by supervised probation and mandatory psychological evaluation. My parents lost custody and were ordered to complete extensive counseling before any consideration of family reunification. I was placed in the temporary custody of the state, with Mrs. Chen approved as my foster parent pending a permanent custody arrangement. It was an unusual solution, but Judge Walsh recognized that sometimes the people who chose to act were more capable of providing safety than those who were biologically obligated to do so. The gavel came down with a sound like a door closing, marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. In the months that followed, I would learn what it meant to live without fear, to sleep without nightmares, to exist without constantly calculating the likelihood of pain. But that learning would come later. For now, I sat in that courtroom and felt the weight of secrets finally lifted, the burden of protection finally shared. For the first time in years, someone else was responsible for keeping me safe. The transition from victim to survivor began in the most mundane way possible, with Mrs. Chen teaching me how to make proper scrambled eggs in her sunlit kitchen on a Tuesday morning in September. I had been living with her for 3 weeks, and we were still learning the delicate choreography of shared space, the careful dance between her need to nurture and my inability to trust kindness without looking for its hidden cost. "The secret is low heat and patience," she said, her weathered hands guiding mine as we stirred the eggs in slow, gentle circles. "You can't rush healing, in cooking or in life." Her kitchen was everything our house on Maple Street hadn't been. Warm, welcoming, filled with the accumulated wisdom of someone who understood that food was love made tangible. Copper pots hung from hooks above the stove, their surfaces burnished bright from years of use. Herbs grew in small pots along the windowsill, their green leaves reaching toward morning sunshine that streamed through curtains she'd sewn herself. The eggs were perfect, creamy, soft, nothing like the rubbery disasters that had emerged from our microwave at home when Mom was too tired to cook, and Dad was too absent to notice we were hungry. Mrs. Chen served them with toast, cut into triangles, and orange juice in a glass that had been chilled in the refrigerator overnight. "Eat slowly," she instructed, settling into the chair across from me with her own breakfast. "Your body is still learning that food will be available whenever you need it." She was right, though I hadn't realized how obvious my starvation responses had become. I'd been wolfing down meals as if someone might snatch them away mid-bite, hoarding snacks in my bedroom dresser, asking permission before taking anything from her refrigerator. The hypervigilance of chronic food insecurity didn't disappear just because I'd moved to a house where groceries appeared magically and meals happened at predictable times. Dr. Amanda Foster, the trauma therapist Judge Walsh had mandated for my treatment, had explained the neurological basis for these behaviors during our first session the week before. She was younger than Dr. Winters, probably in her late 20s, with kind eyes, and an office that felt more like a living room than a medical facility. Soft furniture, warm lighting, books and art that suggested someone who understood that healing happened in safe spaces. Your brain spent years adapting to survive an impossible situation, she'd told me, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. Those adaptations were brilliant problem-solving when you needed them. Now we're going to teach your nervous system that the danger has passed. The concept felt revolutionary, that my hypervigilance, my people-pleasing, my ability to become invisible when adults grew angry weren't character flaws but survival strategies. That the same instincts that had kept me alive in Marcus's laboratory could be redirected toward building a life worth living. But understanding trauma responses intellectually was different from experiencing their slow dissolution in daily life. 3 weeks into my new existence, I still woke up at 3 a.m. expecting to hear footsteps on basement stairs. I still flinched when doors slammed, still apologized reflexively for taking up space, still found reasons to stay awake until I was too exhausted to dream. Mrs. Chen had adapted her routines to accommodate my broken sleep patterns without making me feel guilty about the disruption. She'd started leaving a lamp on in the hallway, so I wouldn't wake up in complete darkness. She'd stocked the kitchen with foods I could prepare quietly if hunger woke me in the middle of the night. She'd established gentle morning rituals that helped ground me in the reality of safety. "Tell me 3 things you can see," she'd say when panic threatened to overwhelm me at breakfast. 3 things you can hear. 3 things you can touch. The exercises were borrowed from Dr. Foster's therapy toolkit, mindfulness techniques designed to anchor traumatized minds in present moment safety. But coming from Mrs. Chen, they felt less like medical intervention and more like grandmother wisdom, the kind of emotional first aid that grandmothers had been providing long before psychology had names for it. Physical therapy for my reconstructed kneecap happened 3 times a week at Millbrook General's Rehabilitation Center, where I worked with Sarah Kim, a physical therapist who had specialized in pediatric trauma recovery. She was patient with my body's reluctance to trust, understanding that muscles remembered fear even after minds accepted safety. "Pain is information," she would remind me as we worked through range of motion exercises that left me sweating and shaking. "But so is strength. We're teaching your body to listen to both." The process was excruciating in ways that went beyond physical discomfort. My knee had healed incorrectly before Dr. Winters' surgery, compensating for damage in ways that affected my entire movement pattern. Correcting those compensations required breaking down movement habits I'd developed over months of untreated injury. But more challenging than the physical rehabilitation was learning to advocate for myself when pain exceeded my tolerance. Years of having my distress dismissed or punished had taught me to endure whatever was happening without complaint. Sarah had to repeatedly remind me that I was allowed to ask for breaks, allowed to say when something hurt too much, allowed to participate in decisions about my own recovery. "Your body belongs to you," she would say, words that sounded simple but felt revolutionary. "You get to decide what happens to it." The concept of bodily autonomy was foreign after years of being treated as Marcus's experimental subject. I'd learned to dissociate from physical sensation, to mentally separate myself from whatever was being done to my body. Reconnecting with physical sensations meant experiencing not just the absence of pain, but the presence of comfort, strength, capability. School presented its own challenges. Millbrook High had been informed about my situation in general terms. Family, disruption requiring temporary placement. But the details of Marcus's crimes remained sealed in juvenile court records. My teachers knew I'd missed significant time due to medical issues and might need accommodations for trauma-related symptoms, but they didn't know that their honor roll student had been systematically torturing his younger sister. Returning to classes where Marcus had been celebrated as an academic superstar felt surreal. His achievements were still displayed on bulletin boards, science fair awards, academic decathlon trophies, scholarship announcements. Teachers spoke about him in past tense now, their voices carefully neutral when asked about his early graduation and departure for residential treatment. My guidance counselor, Mr. Peterson, no relation to our neighbor, had worked with trauma survivors before and understood that academic performance often suffered in the aftermath of family crisis. He'd arranged for modified schedules, extended deadlines, and access to a quiet space when I needed breaks from the sensory overload of crowded hallways. But the most profound support came from unexpected sources. Jenny Martinez, who had sat behind me in algebra for 2 years without us ever speaking, suddenly appeared at my lunch table with homemade cookies and fierce protectiveness. "I always wondered why you seemed scared of everything," she said simply. "I'm glad someone finally figured out why." She didn't press for details or offer hollow reassurances that everything would be fine. Instead, she provided practical solidarity, walking with me between classes, including me in study groups, creating casual opportunities for social connection. That didn't require me to perform normalcy I didn't feel. Other classmates followed her lead, not because they knew what had happened, but because they recognized someone who was struggling and chose to respond with kindness rather than curiosity. The lunch table grew to include Maria Santos, who shared her family's homemade salsa, and David Chen, Mrs. Chen's grandson, visiting from Columbus, who made me laugh with his terrible math jokes. These friendships felt different from the careful alliances I'd formed before, relationships based on mutual protection rather than genuine affection. For the first time, I was experiencing what it meant to be liked for myself, rather than tolerated out of pity or obligation. Dr. Foster helped me understand that this shift in social dynamics reflected changes in how I was presenting myself to the world. When we're no longer using all our energy to survive immediate threats, she explained, we have capacity for the kinds of authentic connection that make life meaningful. The therapy sessions themselves were unlike anything I'd expected. Dr. Foster didn't make me relive traumatic memories or analyze my childhood in excruciating detail. Instead, she focused on present-moment experiences, how my body felt in the chair, what emotions arose when I talked about school, how I could recognize the difference between past danger and current safety. Trauma lives in the body, she said. During one session, her hands demonstrating how nervous systems could become stuck in fight-or-flight mode. Traditional talk therapy addresses the cognitive aspects, but we need to help your whole system understand that the threat has passed. We worked with breathing exercises that seemed deceptively simple, but proved remarkably effective at interrupting panic responses. We practiced grounding techniques that helped me stay present when memories threatened to pull me into the past. We explored the difference between healthy boundaries and hypervigilant defensiveness. But perhaps most importantly, we worked on developing what Dr. Foster called distress tolerance, the ability to experience difficult emotions without immediately needing to escape or fix them. Years of trauma had taught me to avoid pain at all costs, but healing required learning to sit with discomfort long enough to process and integrate difficult experiences. Feelings aren't emergencies, became a mantra I repeated during moments when grief or anger felt overwhelming. They're information. They'll pass through if you let them. The legal proceedings continued in parallel with my healing process, a constant reminder that justice and recovery operated on different timelines. Ms. Martinez provided regular updates about the case, her professional compassion helping me understand that the wheels of bureaucracy moved slowly but steadily toward accountability. Marcus remained in residential treatment at a facility that specialized in adolescents with conduct disorders. The reports from his therapists were mixed. He was compliant with programming, intellectually engaged with treatment concepts, but showed limited, genuine empathy for his victims. He could explain why his behavior had been harmful in clinical terms, but he seemed to view his actions as mistakes in judgment rather than moral failures. Some people can learn to control their behavior without ever developing true empathy, Ms. Martinez explained during one of our monthly check-ins. The goal isn't to make Marcus feel bad about what he did, it's to ensure he never has the opportunity to do it again. My parents had enrolled in family therapy as required by the court, but their progress was even more limited than Marcus's. They attended sessions faithfully, completed assigned exercises, and said the right words about taking responsibility for their failures. But underneath the therapeutic compliance, they maintained the fundamental beliefs that had enabled Marcus's abuse. They still viewed his behavior as the result of mental illness rather than moral choice. They still saw their role as protecting him from consequences rather than protecting me from harm. They still believed that family loyalty should have prevented me from seeking outside help, regardless of what I was enduring at home. Recovery. requires genuine accountability, Dr. Foster explained when I expressed frustration about my parents' superficial changes. Some people can modify their behavior without changing their underlying beliefs. Others are capable of deeper transformation. We can't control which category someone falls into. The distinction mattered because Judge Walsh had made family reunification contingent on demonstrated change, not just compliance with court orders. My parents could complete every required program and attend every mandated session, but if they hadn't fundamentally altered their approach to protecting children, I would never be returned to their custody. Part of me grieved for the family that might have been, the parents who might have chosen my safety over their comfort, the brother who might have channeled his intelligence toward healing rather than harm. But a larger part of me felt profound relief that I wouldn't have to return to a situation where my well-being was negotiable. Mrs. Chen had made it clear that I was welcome in her home indefinitely, not as a temporary placement, but as a chosen daughter. The paperwork for formal adoption was complex, requiring termination of my parents' rights and extensive background checks, but the emotional commitment was already complete. Family isn't just biology, she told me one evening as we worked together in her garden, harvesting vegetables for dinner. It's about who shows up when you need them, who chooses your well-being over their own convenience, who creates safety when the world feels dangerous. The garden had become one of my favorite places, a living metaphor for growth that happened slowly, with attention and care. Mrs. Chen had given me my own plot to tend, and I'd chosen to grow herbs and flowers rather than vegetables. Something about nurturing beauty rather than utility felt important for my recovery. Trauma survivors often struggle with the concept of thriving rather than just surviving, Dr. Foster had observed when I told her about my garden choices. Choosing flowers suggests you're beginning to believe that your life can include joy, not just safety. The first blooms appeared in October, small purple asters that had grown from seeds I'd planted in August with hands that still shook from surgical recovery. They were modest flowers, nothing that would win garden competitions, but they were mine. I had planted them, tended them, watched them grow from possibility into reality. Standing in that garden on a crisp autumn morning, surrounded by evidence of my ability to nurture life rather than just endure suffering, I felt something shift in my understanding of who I was and who I might become. The scared 14-year-old who had arrived at Mrs. Chen's house was still part of me, but she was no longer the only part. Dr. Winters had been right when she said that surgery would change everything. The physical healing had been remarkable. My kneecap was stronger now than it had been before Marcus shattered it, held together with titanium hardware that would last decades. But the emotional healing had been even more profound. I was learning to trust my own perceptions, to believe that my needs mattered, to understand that love shouldn't require enduring harm. I was discovering interests and talents that had been suppressed under the weight of survival, exploring possibilities that hadn't existed when all my energy went to predicting and avoiding danger. Most importantly, I was beginning to imagine a future that extended beyond safety into purpose. College applications sat on my desk, representing opportunities to study psychology, social work, medicine, fields where my experience with trauma could become a foundation for helping others. Survivors often become healers, Dr. Foster had noted when I shared my career interests. Not because trauma makes us wise, but because recovery teaches us that healing is possible even after terrible damage. The revelation felt like a gift, the understanding that my suffering might serve a purpose, that Marcus's attempt to break me had inadvertently prepared me to help others rebuild from their own devastation. By spring, the legal proceedings had concluded, but their impact was just beginning to spread through Millbrook like concentric circles in still water. Judge Walsh's final custody decision had made headlines in the local newspaper. Local teen permanently placed with neighbor after systematic abuse case. And suddenly, our quiet suburban community was forced to confront uncomfortable questions. about what happened behind closed doors. The Millbrook School District implemented new mandatory reporting training for all staff, bringing in experts who specialized in recognizing signs of family violence. Teachers who had worked with Marcus attended sessions on identifying students with conduct disorders, learning to distinguish between academic excellence and predatory manipulation. Mrs. Patterson, my former third-grade teacher, came to visit me one afternoon in April, her face etched with regret and determination in equal measure. She was nearing retirement after 35 years of teaching, but she carried herself with the energy of someone who had found new purpose. "I failed you when you needed me most," she said simply, sitting in Mrs. Chen's living room with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. "I saw the signs. I felt something was wrong, but I didn't trust my instincts enough to push harder." We talked for 2 hours, her professional guilt meeting my adolescent forgiveness in a conversation that felt like a bridge between past wounds and future healing. She had become an advocate for legislative changes that would strengthen mandatory reporting requirements and provide better training for educators. One of the proposals would require annual home visits for any child showing patterns of concerning behavior, she explained, her voice carrying the passion of someone who had transformed personal regret into systematic change. "If we'd had that protocol when you were 8, things might have been different." The legislation, which would later be known as Jessi's Law, faced significant opposition from parent groups who viewed it as government overreach. But Mrs. Patterson had allies now, Dr. Winters, Ms. Martinez, and a growing network of professionals who had seen too many cases like mine slip through the cracks of well-meaning but inadequate systems. The campaign became a family affair for us. Mrs. Chen used her network of retired nurses to organize letter-writing campaigns, while I testified before legislative committees about the importance of trusting children when they tried to communicate distress. The experience was terrifying but empowering, transforming my trauma from something that had happened to me into something that could prevent harm to others. "Your voice carries weight because you survived to use it," Dr. Foster observed when I worried about speaking publicly. "Many victims never get that opportunity." The truth of her words became evident during the first legislative hearing, where my testimony about the progression of Marcus's abuse silenced a room full of seasoned politicians. The detailed medical evidence Dr. Winters presented, combined with my first-hand account of how warning signs had been dismissed or misinterpreted, created a compelling case for systematic reform. Representative Susan Walsh, no relation to Judge Walsh, became the primary sponsor of the legislation, her own experience as a former social worker providing credibility with colleagues who might have dismissed the issue as isolated tragedy rather than systematic failure. "Every year, thousands of children try to tell trusted adults that they're being hurt at home," she said during floor debate. "This legislation ensures that we're equipped to hear them, believe them, and act on their behalf." The bill passed by a narrow margin in June, its implementation scheduled for the following school year. The victory felt surreal. The idea that my pain could be transformed into protection for other children, that Marcus's crimes had inadvertently catalyzed reforms that might prevent similar tragedies. But legislative victories were just one aspect of the changes rippling through our community. The revelation of what had been happening on Maple Street had shattered the comfortable illusion that suburban neighborhoods were inherently safe, that middle-class families were immune to serious dysfunction. Other families began acknowledging their own struggles with domestic violence, mental health crises, and children whose behavior raised concerns that had been dismissed as normal development. The Millbrook Community Center started offering support groups for parents dealing with challenging children, for siblings affected by family violence, for neighbors who suspected abuse but didn't know how to respond. Mrs. Henderson, who had lived across the street from us for 20 years, became one of the most vocal advocates for community vigilance. Her guilt over not recognizing what was happening to me had motivated her to become certified in crisis intervention, and she now facilitated support groups for trauma survivors. "We all heard things," she admitted during one group session I attended, as a guest speaker. Sounds that didn't seem right, patterns that seemed concerning. But we told ourselves it wasn't our business, that families should handle their own problems. We were wrong. The support group met weekly in the community center's multi-purpose room, its members a diverse collection of people whose lives had been touched by family violence in various ways. Some were survivors like me, others were non-offending parents, working to protect their children. Still others were community members trying to process their role as bystanders. Jenny Martinez's mother, Carmen, became a regular attendee after revealing that she'd grown up in an abusive household and had recognized signs in my behavior that reminded her of her own childhood. Her decision to encourage Jenny's friendship with me had been motivated by instinct rather than knowledge, but it had provided crucial social support during my transition to safety. Sometimes the most important intervention is just showing up. Consistently, Carmen shared during one session, just being someone who notices when a child seems scared, who offers kindness without expecting anything in return. The group discussions helped me understand how trauma affected entire communities, not just individual victims. My neighbors had been living with secondary trauma from witnessing what they couldn't name or address, carrying guilt over their inability to protect a child they'd seen growing up on their street. Dr. Foster attended several sessions as a consultant, helping group members understand the psychological dynamics that made family violence so difficult to recognize and address. Her explanations of trauma bonding, learned helplessness, and the complexity of victim behavior helped reduce the self-blame that many community members carried. Perpetrators are often skilled at presenting themselves as normal, even admirable, community members, she explained during one particularly difficult session. They understand that their behavior must remain hidden, so they become experts at managing their public image while terrorizing victims in private. The point was illustrated perfectly by Marcus's reputation before his crimes were revealed. He had been the golden boy of our neighborhood, polite to adults, academically gifted, seemingly destined for success. The contrast between his public persona and private behavior had made it nearly impossible for outsiders to recognize the danger he posed. Even after his conviction, some community members struggled to reconcile the Marcus they thought they knew with the Marcus revealed in court proceedings. His high school guidance counselor attended several support group sessions, processing her shock at discovering that a student she'd championed had been capable of systematic torture. It's challenged everything I thought I knew about identifying troubled students, she confided. Marcus seemed like exactly the kind of young person we hope to produce, intelligent, focused, goal-oriented. I never imagined that those same qualities could be channeled toward causing harm. The realization prompted significant changes in how local schools approach student assessment and intervention. New protocols were developed for evaluating students who seemed too perfect, recognizing that excessive compliance could sometimes mask serious psychological problems rather than indicate healthy development. Marcus himself remained largely absent from these community conversations, his voice limited to court-ordered psychological evaluations and treatment progress reports. The residential facility where he was placed specialized in adolescents with conduct disorders, and their approach focused on behavioral modification rather than community reconciliation. His therapists reported that he had made significant progress in understanding the impact of his actions and developing behavioral controls that would prevent future offenses. But they also noted his limited capacity for genuine empathy and his tendency to view relationships in terms of power dynamics rather than mutual care. The prognosis for individuals with Marcus's profile is variable, Dr. Richard Hayes, his primary therapist, explained during a conference call with our legal team. Some learn to function successfully in society through external behavioral controls, even if their internal emotional development remains limited. The assessment was both hopeful and chilling. The possibility that Marcus might never reoffend, coupled with the understanding that his capacity for genuine human connection would likely remain impaired. He would turn 18 in 2 years, at which point his juvenile sentence would be complete and he would be free to make his own choices. about treatment and supervision. The uncertainty about Marcus's future motivated additional safety planning for my ongoing protection. Judge Walsh had issued a permanent restraining order preventing him from having any contact with me, but legal documents couldn't eliminate the risk entirely once he aged out of state supervision. Dr. Foster helped me develop safety strategies that balanced reasonable precaution with the need to live freely. We discussed college choices that would provide geographic distance, career paths that would offer financial independence, and warning signs that might indicate Marcus was attempting to reestablish contact. The goal isn't to live in fear, she reminded me, but to be prepared for possibilities while focusing primarily on building a life worth protecting. College applications had become a bridge between survival and thriving, representing opportunities to transform my trauma into expertise that could help others. I had been accepted to several programs in social work and psychology, with full scholarships that made education financially feasible despite my complicated family situation. The University of Michigan's social work program had offered the most comprehensive package, including housing, meal plans, and a work-study position in their Campus Crisis Intervention Center. The opportunity to begin my professional training while still an undergraduate felt like an accelerated path toward the career I was beginning to envision. Mrs. Chen had initially worried about my moving so far from the support system we'd built together, but she ultimately recognized that education represented the kind of independence that would serve me well in the long term. We'd begun planning for my departure with the same care she brought to everything, practical preparations balanced with emotional support. "You'll always have a home here," she assured me during one of our evening garden sessions. "But you're ready to start building a home of your own. That's what successful parenting looks like, raising children who don't need you but choose to stay connected anyway." The concept of chosen family had become central to my understanding of relationships and recovery. The people who had supported me through the crisis and its aftermath, Mrs. Chen, Dr. Foster, Mrs. Patterson, Ms. Martinez, even Dr. Winters, had demonstrated what care looked like when it wasn't complicated by biological obligation or social expectation. My relationship with my biological parents remained frozen in a state of legal and emotional limbo. They had completed all court-mandated requirements, attended every therapy session, and expressed appropriate remorse in all the right forums. But underneath the therapeutic compliance, their fundamental beliefs about family loyalty, children's rights, and parental authority remained unchanged. They sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts through Ms. Martinez, their messages expressing love while carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of specific wrongdoing. They attended court hearings when required and made appropriate statements about supporting my recovery, but they never requested direct contact or expressed understanding of why I might not want a relationship with them. Some people can change their behavior without changing their beliefs, Dr. Foster observed when I struggled with guilt over not wanting reconciliation. Your parents may genuinely love you while still believing that your loyalty should have prevented you from seeking help. Both things can be true simultaneously. The paradox was emotionally exhausting. The possibility that my parents' love was real but insufficient to guarantee my safety, that their grief over losing me was genuine but not powerful enough to motivate genuine accountability. I had spent years hoping for their protection and love, only to discover that their version of love was conditional on my silence. The legal system had provided justice in terms of Marcus's punishment and my safety, but it couldn't mandate the kind of emotional repair that would make family relationships possible again. Some wounds, I was learning, healed best in the absence of the people who had caused them. My junior year of high school was winding down with a normalcy that still felt miraculous after years of chaos. I was taking AP classes, participating in debate team, working part-time at the community center teaching art to younger children. The activities that had once seemed impossible, anything that required staying after school or making plans with friends, were now routine aspects of a life built around possibility rather than survival. The children I worked with at the community center didn't know my history, but they responded to something in my approach that seemed to put them at ease. Kids who had been labeled as difficult or disruptive often calmed down in my presence, as if they recognized someone who understood what it felt like to be misunderstood. "You have a natural gift for this work," observed Maria Santos, the center's program coordinator, who had become both supervisor and mentor. "These kids trust you in a way that's unusual for someone your age." The work felt like a preview of my intended career, an opportunity to discover whether my theoretical interest in helping trauma survivors translated into practical skill. The answer seemed to be yes. My ability to remain calm during children's emotional storms, to recognize signs of distress that others missed, to create safety through consistency and respect rather than authority, all seemed to come naturally. One of the children, 8-year-old Tyler, had been bounced between several programs due to behavioral challenges that left other staff feeling frustrated and defeated. He was angry, defiant, quick to escalate minor conflicts into major confrontations. Other adults saw him as a problem to be managed. I saw him as someone who had learned that aggression was the most effective way to maintain control in an unpredictable world. "Tyler reminds me of someone I used to know," I told Maria after a particularly challenging session where he'd thrown art supplies and screamed at another child. Someone who felt powerless and found ways to take power back, even if those ways hurt people. The observation led to a different approach, giving Tyler choices whenever possible, acknowledging his feelings even when his behavior needed redirection, helping him develop skills for managing frustration before it escalated into rage. The changes were gradual but unmistakable. Within weeks, his outbursts became less frequent and less intense. "What did you do differently?" Maria asked after Tyler completed an entire week without a single incident report. "I started from the assumption that his behavior made sense," I replied. "Once I understood what he was trying to accomplish, I could help him find better ways to accomplish it." The approach reflected everything I'd learned about trauma and resilience, about the difference between punishment and accountability, about how safety was created through relationship rather than control. Working with Tyler felt like healing my own childhood by providing the kind of understanding I'd needed but never received. By May, Tyler was helping other children with their art projects, his natural leadership channeled toward building others up rather than tearing them down. His transformation became a source of hope for other staff members working with challenging children, evidence that behavioral problems often masked deeper needs that could be addressed with patience and skill. "You're going to be an amazing social worker," Maria told me during my final evaluation. "These kids have taught you things that graduate school can't provide: how to recognize trauma, how to create safety, how to help people heal. You're already practicing the profession you're planning to study." The validation felt like a bridge between past pain and future purpose, confirmation that my experiences with Marcus and my family's dysfunction were being transformed into skills that could prevent other children from enduring similar harm. My trauma was becoming my qualification. My survival was becoming my credential. Graduation day arrived with the kind of perfect spring weather that made everything feel possible. I walked across the stage to receive my diploma as Mrs. Chen cheered from the audience, her pride evident from 3 rows back. Dr. Foster was there too, along with Maria and several of the children from the community center program. The moment felt like a closing ceremony for one chapter of life and the opening credits for another. High school was ending, college was beginning, and I was ready for both transitions in ways that had seemed impossible just 2 years earlier, when I'd been lying on our driveway with a shattered kneecap and a broken understanding of what family was supposed to mean. 5 years later, I stood in the campus quad at the University of Michigan, my master's degree in social work finally complete, watching families celebrate their graduating students under a canopy of oak trees that reminded me of the one in our old backyard on Maple Street. The irony wasn't lost on me. How trees that had once symbolized the site of my trauma could now represent growth, endurance, and the beauty that emerged from deep roots planted in difficult soil. Mrs. Chen had made the trip from Ohio, her face radiant with the kind of pride that biological parents claimed but chosen family actually earned. At 73, she moved more slowly than she once had, but her sharp eyes missed nothing as she surveyed the crowd of celebrating families, perhaps cataloging the differences between genuine joy and performative affection. "Look at you," she said, straightening my graduation cap with hands that still smelled faintly of the lavender soap she'd used for as long as I'd known her. "Dr. Foster always said you'd become a healer." She was right. Dr. Foster herself had been unable to attend. She was presenting research at a trauma conference in Seattle, but she'd sent a card with a handwritten note that I'd read so many times the creases were wearing thin. "Your journey from victim to survivor to thriver has been extraordinary to witness," she'd written. "Thank you for trusting me with your healing and for showing me what courage looks like in practice." The graduation ceremony felt like a culmination of everything that had begun in that hospital room 7 years earlier, when Dr. Winters had first explained mandatory reporting. Every class I'd taken, every internship I'd completed, every client I'd worked with had been preparation for this moment. Not just receiving a degree, but stepping fully into the role I'd been unconsciously preparing for since the day Marcus's violence had shattered more than just my kneecap. My thesis research had focused on sibling abuse, a form of family violence that remained largely hidden and poorly understood by both professionals and the general public. The data I'd collected through interviews with survivors painted a disturbing picture of systematic harm disguised as normal sibling rivalry, enabled by parents who couldn't or wouldn't recognize the difference between typical conflict and predatory behavior. The most significant finding, I'd written in my conclusion, is not the prevalence of sibling abuse, but the consistency with which it's minimized, dismissed, or misinterpreted by adults in positions to intervene. When parents view one child as inherently more valuable or promising than another, they create conditions where abuse becomes not just possible, but inevitable. The research had been both personally triggering and professionally illuminating. Interviewing other survivors of sibling violence had helped me understand that Marcus's behavior, while extreme, followed patterns that were disturbingly common. The combination of parental favoritism, academic achievement as a shield for antisocial behavior, and the cultural assumption that family members couldn't pose serious danger to each other created perfect conditions for abuse to flourish undetected. Several of my interview subjects had stories that paralleled mine. Siblings who used intelligence to rationalize cruelty, parents who mistook their abuser's compliance with authority for moral development, warning signs that were consistently reframed as evidence of giftedness rather than pathology. The commonalities suggested that Marcus wasn't an anomaly, but rather an example of what happened when certain risk factors aligned without appropriate intervention. My graduate advisor, Dr. Margaret Kim, had encouraged me to expand the research into my doctoral dissertation, but I'd decided to enter practice instead. 7 years of academic analysis felt like enough. I was ready to work directly with families, to intervene in real time, rather than document patterns after damage had been done. The job offer had come from the Children's Advocacy Center in Grand Rapids, a nonprofit organization that coordinated services for child abuse victims and their families. The position combined direct therapy with policy advocacy, allowing me to work with individual clients while also pushing for systematic changes that might prevent future cases. The interview process had been intensive, multiple rounds of questions, extensive background checks, psychological evaluation to ensure that my personal history enhanced rather than hindered my professional effectiveness. The final interview had been conducted by the center's director, Susan Walsh Martinez, who happened to be the daughter of Representative Susan Walsh and had grown up hearing about Jessi's law at family dinner tables. "Your story is already having an impact on child protection policy," she'd told me during that final interview. "The question is whether you're ready to expand that impact through direct practice. This work will require you to sit with other people's trauma while managing Your own triggers. It's not easy, even for people without personal experience. I'd been honest about my limitations, that cases involving sibling abuse would always affect me more deeply than others, that I'd need ongoing supervision and support to maintain appropriate boundaries, that my recovery was ongoing rather than complete. But I'd also been clear about my strengths, my ability to recognize signs that other professionals missed, my credibility with clients who'd learned not to trust adults, my understanding of how systems failed vulnerable children and how they might be improved. The job had been mine, contingent on completing my degree and passing the licensing exam. Both milestones were now behind me, and in 2 weeks I would begin the work I'd been preparing for since Mrs. Chen had first called 911 from our driveway. The celebration dinner that evening was held at Mrs. Chen's favorite restaurant, a small family-owned place that served authentic Sichuan cuisine and reminded her of meals from her childhood in Taiwan. The guest list was carefully curated, people who had been part of my healing journey rather than my trauma history. Dr. Foster had flown in from Seattle after her conference, and Maria Santos had driven up from Millbrook with updates about the community center programs. Over-steamed fish, and kung pao chicken. We talked about the future, my upcoming move to Grand Rapids, Mrs. Chen's plans to relocate to a senior living community closer to my new job, Dr. Foster's latest research on trauma-informed school interventions. The conversation felt normal in ways that still surprised me. The easy flow of people who cared about each other discussing ordinary concerns and exciting possibilities. Have you given any thought to contact with your biological family? Doctor. Foster asked gently, her clinical training evident in how she framed sensitive questions. Sometimes major life transitions prompt people to reconsider those relationships. The question wasn't unexpected, but it still created a moment of silence around the table. My biological parents had continued their court-mandated therapy and had made repeated requests through Ms. Martinez for supervised contact. Marcus had completed his juvenile sentence and aged out of state supervision, though he'd voluntarily continued therapy and maintained employment at a research laboratory, where his intellectual gifts could be channeled into work that didn't involve human subjects. I get updates through the legal system, I said carefully. Marcus is apparently doing well in treatment and has never reoffended. My parents have completed every requirement and express appropriate remorse, but wanting relationship requires more than meeting external criteria. The truth was more complicated than I could easily explain. I felt no anger toward any of them anymore. Anger had given way to something closer to anthropological curiosity about people who had once been central to my life, but now felt like characters from someone else's story. They had become case studies. In my own mind, examples of how families could fail and systems could adapt. My parents' requests for contact felt performative rather than authentic, motivated by their need to resolve guilt rather than genuine interest in my well-being. They wanted forgiveness as a product they could obtain through sufficient effort, rather than understanding forgiveness as a byproduct of transformed relationship. Marcus's evolution was more interesting but equally distant. According to court-mandated psychological evaluations, he had developed genuine behavioral controls and intellectual understanding of his impact on others. But his letters, forwarded through the legal system, read like academic papers analyzing his own pathology rather than expressions of authentic remorse or relationship interest. Some relationships don't survive certain types of damage, Mrs. Chen observed, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had chosen love over biology when she'd taken me in. That doesn't make you vengeful or unforgiving. It makes you realistic about what's possible and what's healthy. Dr. Foster nodded agreement. Recovery doesn't require reconciliation. Sometimes the healthiest choice is to build new relationships based on mutual care, rather than trying to repair old ones based on obligation. The conversation moved on to lighter topics, but the exchange had clarified something important for me. I had spent years hoping my biological family would transform into people capable of genuine relationship. Their partial progress, Marcus's behavioral control, my parents' therapeutic compliance, represented real change, but not the kind of fundamental shift that would make trust possible. My chosen family, sitting around this restaurant table, had demonstrated what love looked like when it wasn't complicated by guilt, obligation, or the need to maintain illusions. They had seen me at my worst and chosen to stay involved in my healing. They celebrated my achievements without taking credit for them and supported my struggles without taking responsibility for solving them. The realization felt liberating rather than sad. I could acknowledge my biological family's limited progress, while choosing to invest my emotional energy in relationships that felt reciprocal and life-giving. Recovery didn't require forgiveness. It required discernment about where to direct my capacity for connection. 3 months into my new job at the Children's Advocacy Center, I was assigned a case that felt like looking into a funhouse mirror of my own history. 14-year-old Emma Rodriguez had been hospitalized with multiple fractures that her 16-year-old brother claimed were the result of a skateboarding accident. The medical evidence suggested otherwise, and Emma's reluctance to contradict her brother's story was achingly familiar. Emma's parents were educated professionals, a college professor and a nurse, who spoke eloquently about their son's academic achievements and their daughter's tendency toward attention-seeking behavior. They had explanations for every injury, justifications for every concerning pattern, and genuine bewilderment about why anyone would question their family dynamics. The parallels to my own case were so precise they felt almost surreal. The golden child who could do no wrong, the scapegoated sibling who was blamed for her own victimization, the parents whose investment in their preferred narrative prevented them from protecting their vulnerable child. Even the ages were identical. I had been 14 when Dr. Winters had first filed her report. "I know this case feels personal," my supervisor, Janet Morrison, said during our weekly consultation meeting. "Your lived experience is an asset here, but we need to make sure it doesn't overwhelm your clinical judgment." She was right to be concerned. My first instinct had been to bypass the careful investigation process and immediately seek emergency custody removal. I wanted to spare Emma the months of legal proceedings, the family therapy sessions where her abuser would be treated as a troubled child rather than a dangerous predator, the psychological evaluations that would question her credibility while examining his potential for rehabilitation. But my personal urgency had to be balanced against professional protocol and Emma's own agency in determining her path forward. Unlike my case, where medical evidence had made denial impossible, Emma's situation was more ambiguous. Her injuries could conceivably have been accidental. Her reluctance to speak could reflect normal family loyalty rather than terrorized silence. "What do you see in Emma that makes you certain she's being abused?" Janet asked, her question designed to help me separate observation from assumption. The answer came from years of recognizing my own survival strategies in other people's behavior. Emma's hypervigilance when her brother entered the room. The way she monitored adult facial expressions for signs of disappointment or disbelief. Her practiced ability to minimize her own needs while anticipating others' expectations. The careful way she spoke about her family, using words that sounded loving but conveyed no actual warmth. "She's performing normalcy," I said finally. "Everything about her presentation feels calculated to avoid triggering adult concern." That level of self-monitoring isn't typical for healthy 14-year-olds. The assessment proved accurate. Over several weeks of patient rapport building, Emma began sharing details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of systematic abuse disguised as sibling rivalry. Her brother's accidents were carefully planned experiments in pain, tolerance. Her parents' blindness to the pattern was willful rather than innocent, motivated by their investment in their son's potential rather than their daughter's safety. The case moved through the legal system with depressing predictability. Initial denial, grudging acknowledgement of family problems, requests for in-home services rather than custody disruption. Emma's parents hired attorneys and therapists, completed parenting classes and family counseling, said all the right words about taking responsibility while maintaining their fundamental belief that their daughter was exaggerating minor sibling conflicts. But this time, the professionals involved were better trained to recognize the patterns. Dr. Winters, now serving as medical director for the county's child protection team, provided expert testimony about injury patterns that made Emma's brother's story impossible to maintain. The investigating social worker had completed training based on research I'd conducted, giving her tools to recognize sibling abuse that hadn't been available during my own case. Most importantly, Emma had an advocate who understood exactly what she was experiencing because I'd survived it myself. I could interpret her silences, validate her fears, and help her understand that her brother's intelligence didn't make his behavior acceptable or her parents' education excuse their enabling. "You believe me," she said during one of our sessions, her voice carrying the same wonder I'd felt when Dr. Winters had first taken my injuries seriously. "You understand what it's really like." The therapeutic relationship felt like healing my own childhood by providing the advocacy I'd needed, but hadn't received until crisis made denial impossible. Every session with Emma was simultaneously about her recovery and my own continued healing, a reminder that survivor and healer weren't separate roles, but different aspects of the same identity. The celebration dinner that evening was held at Mrs. Chen's favorite restaurant, a small family-owned place that served authentic Sichuan cuisine and reminded her of meals from her childhood in Taiwan. The guest list was carefully curated, people who had been part of my healing journey rather than my trauma history. Dr. Foster had flown in from Seattle after her conference, and Maria Santos had driven up from Millbrook with updates about the community center programs. Over-steamed fish and kung pao chicken. We talked about the future, my upcoming move to Grand Rapids, Mrs. Chen's plans to relocate to a senior living community closer to my new job, Dr. Foster's latest research on trauma-informed school interventions. The conversation felt normal in ways that still surprised me. The easy flow of people who cared about each other discussing ordinary concerns and exciting possibilities. "Have you given any thought to contact with your biological family?" "Doctor," Foster asked gently, her clinical training evident in how she framed sensitive questions. "Sometimes major life transitions prompt people to reconsider those relationships." The question wasn't unexpected, but it still created a moment of silence around the table. My biological parents had continued their court-mandated therapy and had made repeated requests through Ms. Martinez for supervised contact. Marcus had completed his juvenile sentence and aged out of state supervision, though he'd voluntarily continued therapy and maintained employment at a research laboratory, where his intellectual gifts could be channeled into work that didn't involve human subjects. "I get updates through the legal system," I said carefully. "Marcus is apparently doing well in treatment and has never reoffended. My parents have completed every requirement and express appropriate remorse, but wanting relationship requires more than meeting external criteria." The truth was more complicated than I could easily explain. I felt no anger toward any of them anymore. Anger had given way to something closer to anthropological curiosity about people who had once been central to my life, but now felt like characters from someone else's story. They had become case studies. In my own mind, examples of how families could fail and systems could adapt. My parents' requests for contact felt performative rather than authentic, motivated by their need to resolve guilt rather than genuine interest in my well-being. They wanted forgiveness as a product they could obtain through sufficient effort, rather than understanding forgiveness as a byproduct of transformed relationship. Marcus's evolution was more interesting but equally distant. According to court-mandated psychological evaluations, he had developed genuine behavioral controls and intellectual understanding of his impact on others. But his letters, forwarded through the legal system, read like academic papers analyzing his own pathology rather than expressions of authentic remorse or relationship interest. "Some relationships don't survive certain types of damage," Mrs. Chen observed. her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had chosen love over biology when she'd taken me in. That doesn't make you vengeful or unforgiving. It makes you realistic about what's possible and what's healthy. Dr. Foster nodded agreement. Recovery doesn't require reconciliation. Sometimes the healthiest choice is to build new relationships based on mutual care, rather than trying to repair old ones based on obligation. The conversation moved on to lighter topics, but the exchange had clarified something important for me. I had spent years hoping my biological family would transform into people capable of genuine relationship. Their partial progress, Marcus's behavioral control, my parents' therapeutic compliance, represented real change, but not the kind of fundamental shift that would make trust possible. My chosen family, sitting around this restaurant table, had demonstrated what love looked like when it wasn't complicated by guilt, obligation, or the need to maintain illusions. They had seen me at my worst and chosen to stay involved in my healing. They celebrated my achievements without taking credit for them and supported my struggles without taking responsibility for solving them. The realization felt liberating rather than sad. I could acknowledge my biological family's limited progress, while choosing to invest my emotional energy in relationships that felt reciprocal and life-giving. Recovery didn't require forgiveness. It required discernment about where to direct my capacity for connection. 3 months into my new job at the Children's Advocacy Center, I was assigned a case that felt like looking into a funhouse mirror of my own history. 14-year-old Emma Rodriguez had been hospitalized with multiple fractures that her 16-year-old brother claimed were the result of a skateboarding accident. The medical evidence suggested otherwise, and Emma's reluctance to contradict her brother's story was achingly familiar. Emma's parents were educated professionals, a college professor and a nurse, who spoke eloquently about their son's academic achievements and their daughter's tendency toward attention-seeking behavior. They had explanations for every injury, justifications for every concerning pattern, and genuine bewilderment about why anyone would question their family dynamics. The parallels to my own case were so precise they felt almost surreal. The golden child who could do no wrong, the scapegoated sibling who was blamed for her own victimization, the parents whose investment in their preferred narrative prevented them from protecting their vulnerable child. Even the ages were identical. I had been 14 when Dr. Winters had first filed her report. "I know this case feels personal," my supervisor, Janet Morrison, said during our weekly consultation meeting. "Your lived experience is an asset here, but we need to make sure it doesn't overwhelm your clinical judgment." She was right to be concerned. My first instinct had been to bypass the careful investigation process and immediately seek emergency custody removal. I wanted to spare Emma the months of legal proceedings, the family therapy sessions where her abuser would be treated as a troubled child rather than a dangerous predator, the psychological evaluations that would question her credibility while examining his potential for rehabilitation. But my personal urgency had to be balanced against professional protocol and Emma's own agency in determining her path forward. Unlike my case, where medical evidence had made denial impossible, Emma's situation was more ambiguous. Her injuries could conceivably have been accidental. Her reluctance to speak could reflect normal family loyalty rather than terrorized silence. "What do you see in Emma that makes you certain she's being abused?" Janet asked, her question designed to help me separate observation from assumption. The answer came from years of recognizing my own survival strategies in other people's behavior. Emma's hypervigilance when her brother entered the room. The way she monitored adult facial expressions for signs of disappointment or disbelief. Her practiced ability to minimize her own needs while anticipating others' expectations. The careful way she spoke about her family, using words that sounded loving but conveyed no actual warmth. "She's performing normalcy," I said finally. "Everything about her presentation feels calculated to avoid triggering adult concern." That level of self-monitoring isn't typical for healthy 14-year-olds. The assessment proved accurate. Over several weeks of patient rapport building, Emma began sharing details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of systematic abuse, disguised as sibling rivalry. Her brother's accidents were carefully planned experiments in pain, tolerance. Her parents' blindness to the pattern was willful rather than innocent, motivated by their investment in their son's potential rather than their daughter's safety. The case moved through the legal system with depressing predictability. Initial denial, grudging acknowledgement of family problems, requests for in-home services rather than custody disruption. Emma's parents hired attorneys and therapists, completed parenting classes and family counseling, said all the right words about taking responsibility while maintaining their fundamental belief that their daughter was exaggerating minor sibling conflicts. But this time, the professionals involved were better trained to recognize the patterns. Dr. Winters, now serving as medical director for the county's child protection team, provided expert testimony about injury patterns that made Emma's brother's story impossible to maintain. The investigating social worker had completed training based on research I'd conducted, giving her tools to recognize sibling abuse that hadn't been available during my own case. Most importantly, Emma had an advocate who understood exactly what she was experiencing because I'd survived it myself. I could interpret her silences, validate her fears, and help her understand that her brother's intelligence didn't make his behavior acceptable or her parents' education excuse their enabling. "You believe me," she said during one of our sessions, her voice carrying the same wonder I'd felt when Dr. Winters had first taken my injuries seriously. "You understand what it's really like." The therapeutic relationship felt like healing my own childhood by providing the advocacy I'd needed, but hadn't received until crisis made denial impossible. Every session with Emma was simultaneously about her recovery and my own continued healing, a reminder that survivor and healer weren't separate roles, but different aspects of the same identity. Emma's case resolved more quickly than mine had, perhaps because the systems had evolved in response to cases like mine. Her brother was placed in residential treatment, her parents lost custody pending completion of extensive therapy, and Emma was placed with relatives who had been trying to intervene for years, but hadn't been taken seriously by child protection workers. The successful outcome felt like vindication for all the advocacy work that had grown from my own trauma. Emma would have years of recovery ahead of her, but she wouldn't have to navigate them alone or without professional understanding of what she'd endured. The systems that had failed me had been strengthened enough to protect her. 6 months later, I received a letter that made me understand how healing could ripple outward in ways that were impossible to predict. It was from Tyler, the angry 8-year-old I'd worked with at the community center during my final year of high school. Now 13 and in middle school, he'd written to tell me that he was planning to become a social worker too. "You saw something in me that no other adult ever saw," he'd written in careful middle school handwriting. "You helped me understand that being angry didn't make me bad. It meant I was hurt. I want to help other kids the way you helped me." The letter arrived on a particularly difficult day when I'd been questioning whether individual therapy could ever address the systematic factors that enabled child abuse. Tyler's words reminded me that healing happened in relationship, one connection at a time, and that survivors who became healers could plant seeds that would grow in ways they'd never know about. That evening, I called Mrs. Chen to read her Tyler's letter. At 74, she was settling into her new apartment near my work, her days filled with volunteer activities, and her evenings spent tending a small balcony garden that reminded her of our shared afternoons among the herbs and flowers. "You see?" she said when I finished reading, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose faith in human potential had been repeatedly validated. "This is how trauma gets transformed into wisdom, how pain becomes purpose. Tyler learned from you what you learned from all of us, that healing is possible, that people can change, that love is stronger than harm." The conversation lasted 2 hours, ranging from Tyler's letter to updates about Emma's progress to my own continuing recovery work. At 31, I was still in therapy with Dr. Foster, still processing the layers of trauma that revealed themselves as life became safer and more complex. Recovery, I'd learned, wasn't a destination, but a practice, a daily choice to engage with life from a foundation of self-care rather than survival. "Are you happy?" Mrs. Chen asked toward the end of our call. The question she'd been asking regularly since I'd moved away from Ohio. The answer required consideration. Happiness felt like too simple a word for the complex emotional landscape I inhabited, a terrain that included profound gratitude alongside occasional grief, professional fulfillment complicated by vicarious trauma, personal relationships enriched by chosen family and complicated by biological history. "I'm purposeful," I said finally. "I'm connected to people I love and work that matters. I'm building something meaningful from experiences that could have destroyed me. If that's not happiness, it's close enough." As I write this, it's been 10 years since Dr. Winters first explained mandatory reporting to a 14-year-old girl with a shattered kneecap and a broken understanding of family. The anniversary doesn't pass unnoticed. Each year on that date, I take time to acknowledge how far I've traveled from that hospital bed and how many people made the journey possible. Marcus is now 27, working as a laboratory researcher, and reportedly maintaining the behavioral controls he developed during treatment. He's never attempted contact, and I've never sought it. Our parallel lives continue in separate orbits, connected by shared history but not by ongoing relationship. My biological parents still send holiday cards through the legal system, their messages expressing love while carefully avoiding any reference to the choices that made estrangement necessary. I read their updates with curiosity rather than longing, interested in their progress while accepting that some bridges remain too damaged for safe crossing. Emma, now 17, is thriving in her placement with extended family and plans to study education in college. She wants to become a teacher, she told me recently, so she can recognize signs that other educators might miss. Her resilience continues to inspire my own recovery work, reminding me that survival can become strength when supported by adults who choose children's well-being over their own comfort. Tyler started high school this fall and volunteers at the same community center where I once worked with him. His transformation from angry child to compassionate teenager demonstrates how early intervention can redirect trajectories that might otherwise lead to tragedy. His letters update me regularly on his academic progress and his growing commitment to social justice work. Mrs. Chen, now 76, remains the anchor of my chosen family, the person who modeled what unconditional love could look like when it wasn't complicated by biology or obligation. Her health is declining gradually but gracefully, and we've begun having conversations about end-of-life planning that feel both sad and sacred. She has given me the gift of security, the knowledge that I am deeply loved by someone who chose me rather than being obligated to tolerate me. Dr. Foster continues to supervise my most challenging cases and provide consultation when personal. Triggers threaten to overwhelm professional boundaries. Our relationship has evolved from therapist-client to mentor-colleague, but she remains the person who first helped me understand that healing was possible even after terrible damage. Teruai. Work itself continues to challenge and fulfill me in equal measure. Each case brings new opportunities to intervene in cycles of family violence, to advocate for children who can't protect themselves, to demonstrate that trauma can be transformed into wisdom when supported by competent professionals and caring communities. Some days are harder than others. Cases that mirror my own experience can trigger flashbacks that require careful management. The slow pace of systematic change can feel frustrating when individual children need immediate protection. The complexity of family dynamics can make clear-cut solutions impossible even when harm is obvious. But the difficult days are balanced by moments of profound meaning. When a frightened child begins to trust that adults can provide safety, when A family learns to protect, rather than exploit vulnerability, when systematic changes prevent other children from enduring what I survived. This story began with violence that shattered more than bone. It broke fundamental assumptions about family, safety, and the reliability of adult protection. It continues with the recognition that healing is possible, that trauma can become wisdom, and that survivors can become healers when supported by people who understand that love means choosing someone's well-being over your own comfort. The 14-year-old girl who lay on that driveway 10 years ago couldn't have imagined the life that would grow from those broken pieces. She couldn't have envisioned the career that would emerge from her pain, the relationships that would replace the family that failed to protect her, or the meaning that would transform suffering into service. But she survived. She healed. She learned to trust again, to love again, to hope again. And in doing so, she discovered that recovery isn't just about returning to who you were before trauma. It's about becoming who you were always meant to be, with trauma as one chapter in a longer story of resilience, purpose, and connection. The scars remain, both visible and invisible. My knee still aches before storms, a physical reminder of the day everything changed. My nervous system still carries traces of hypervigilance that will probably never completely disappear. Some relationships will always require more conscious effort than they would for people whose childhoods included consistent safety and unconditional love. But scars are also evidence of healing, proof that bodies and souls can repair themselves when given adequate support and time. They're reminders of survival, testimonies to resilience, and preparation for helping others whose wounds are still fresh and frightening. 10 years later, I understand what Dr. Winters meant when she said that surgery would change everything. The physical healing was remarkable. Titanium hardware that made my kneecap stronger than it had been before Marcus shattered it. But the emotional healing was even more profound, a reconstruction of identity from victim to survivor to healer. The girl who was broken has become the woman who helps others rebuild. The child who was silenced has found her voice in advocacy. The patient who was healed has learned to heal others. The cycle of trauma that might have continued for generations has been interrupted, transformed into a cycle of recovery that will touch lives I may never know about. This is how healing happens, not in dramatic moments of revelation, but in daily choices to engage with life from a foundation of self-care, rather than survival. Not in forgetting what happened, but in transforming it into wisdom. Not in pretending trauma didn't matter, but in refusing to let it be the final word. My story continues, no longer defined by what was done to me, but by what I choose to do with the life I've built from broken pieces. It's a story that belongs not just to me, but to every survivor who refused to let trauma write their ending, to every professional who chose children's well-being over institutional convenience, to every community member who decided that bystander status was not an option when children needed protection. It's a story of hope made real through the accumulated choices of people who understood that healing is possible, that love is stronger than harm, and that broken things can become beautiful when tended by hands that know what wholeness looks like. The 14-year-old on that driveway couldn't have imagined this future, but she planted its seeds when she finally trusted Mrs. Chen enough to ask for help. Everything that followed grew from that moment of courage, the choice to speak truth despite years of conditioning toward silence, to seek safety despite every message that loyalty required accepting harm. That choice echoes in every case I handle, every client I serve, every system I help change. It reverberates through Emma's recovery, through Tyler's transformation, through legislation that bears my name and protects children I'll never meet. It lives in the work of Dr. Foster, Mrs. Patterson, and hundreds of other professionals who learned from my case and carry that knowledge into their daily practice. This is trauma's alchemy, the transformation of suffering into service, of victimization into advocacy, of isolation into connection. It's the evidence that no experience, however terrible, is meaningless if it can be used to prevent others from enduring similar harm. The story that began with a baseball bat and a shattered kneecap continues with a career built on the understanding that children deserve protection, that families can be created by choice as well as biology, and that healing is always possible when supported by people who understand what love actually means. 10 years later, I am living proof that recovery is real, that trauma can become wisdom, and that survivors can become healers when given the support they need to transform their pain into purpose. The scared 14-year-old who once lay broken on a driveway has become someone who helps other broken children learn to heal, to trust, to hope again. That transformation is the real victory. Not just surviving Marcus's violence, but building a life of such meaning and connection that his attempt to destroy me ultimately served to prepare me for work that touches hundreds of lives and changes systems that protect thousands more. This is what healing looks like. Not the absence of scars, but the presence of purpose. Not forgetting what happened, but refusing to be defined by it. Not pretending family dysfunction doesn't matter, but choosing to create new definitions of family based on care rather than biology. The 14-year-old who was broken has become the adult who helps others rebuild. The patient who is healed has learned to heal others. The cycle stops here, transformed into something that creates safety rather than perpetuating harm. That's the real ending to this story. Not an ending at all, but a beginning that continues to unfold with every life touched, every system changed, every child protected because someone chose to believe that healing was possible and trauma could become wisdom. The girl on the driveway survived. She more than survived. She thrived, she served, she transformed suffering into purpose and isolation into connection. That transformation continues in every person she helps heal, every professional she trains, every policy she influences. This is how broken children become healing adults. This is how trauma becomes triumph. This is how the worst things that happen to us can become the foundation for the most meaningful work we do. The story continues. No longer mine alone, but part of a larger narrative about resilience, recovery, and the possibility of transformation that lives in every person who refuses to let trauma write their final chapter. If this story moved you, challenged your perspective, or opened your eyes to the hidden realities of family trauma, I invite you to become part of our community.